when you go to the very, very first written documents that aren't like transactional, whatever, farmer Urnamu had 20 sheep, and he paid whatever 12 pieces of shekels for that. We're talking about like the first like proto literature, the first stories that we have access to in the archaeological record. These are instruction literature. Sometimes there's a few of these, like in Egypt, that certain sources might claim are the oldest texts in the history of literature. I've looked a little bit at the instructions of Shuruppak, which I heard somewhere. This is a Mesopotamian Sumerian text, which is apparently the oldest book ever written, or however you want to count that, even though it's probably not a very long book. But it doesn't matter who did it first, because we could always discover something older. The point is, a lot of this early stuff, kind of like approximately, probably within a few centuries, or like one millennia or two, maybe one millennia or a few centuries, it coincides with the development of cities. So a lot of the writing is just about the practicality of living in this new agricultural society where everybody lives in the same city. And a lot of what that's about is just figuring out, like, hey, how are we going to do this? How are we going to remember how many sheep farmer Utnapishtim bought? Okay, those are all like the names of kings for if these Sumerian names. I don't know that many ancient Sumerian people. And then with, for example, the instructions of Shuruppak, how do you interact with other people in a city? Because unlike the nomadic tribes and whatever else hunter-gathering stuff we were doing before, where everybody that you ever met was either your friends and family who you knew your whole life, or your enemy in a war, and there's like no in between. In a city, all of a sudden there's this concept of a stranger, somebody who you aren't going to kill, and you have to like coincide with them, but you also like don't know them really well. And so how are you going to like trust them? How are they going to trust you? How's that going to work out? And a lot, I think, of this early instruction literature is about basically morality. And then it, or I'm gonna say like proto-morality. It becomes about laws very quickly when you get into the law codes of in Sumeria, and then later, I guess, Akkadian societies. It would have been, I don't think we have a copy of it, but there's supposed to have been a text called the Laws of Urukagina. I think I'm saying that right. And then the oldest one we have, I believe, is the Laws of Ur-Nammu. And then a more famous one is the Laws of Hammurabi. Maybe he was Babylonian. I forget. But the point is, it's just about figuring out how we're going to coincide in this city, in this culture where we have time for specialization and writing. And then even in like the Hebrew Bible, you have stuff like that. I think the earliest instruction literature, I think for the most part, it even precedes writing down their myths. But you might still write down your myths, and then it might get transmitted across time and place, which might have been the point of writing it down partly in the first place. Although you could also transmit it orally, which can also be very effective. But basically, this was a very badly named section of a reason why we engage with literature, but it's basically talking about how across time and across cultures, the same story will get retold and reshaped for a different time, so that there is like a lineage of, for example, the Epic of Gilgamesh was drawing on earlier literature, and perhaps as we delve into this more, I'll actually read the Epic of Gilgamesh in full instead of just listening to whatever lecture I've heard about it so far. And you'll have the flood myth, I believe, is mentioned in Gilgamesh, although this is the thing, I don't really know where. And that's perhaps inspired by, if not drawing from the same source as an earlier Sumerian text called Atrahasis, which is basically like the biblical flood myth pretty much, with some differences, where Atrahasis, instead of Noah, is, the one guy to have built an ark or whatever it is. And of course, in Genesis, the idea is that they're drawing on that earlier tradition of Mesopotamian literature. And then, in turn, a lot of the literature from the last 2,000 years, for us, has been drawing on the tradition of the Bible. And a lot of like the great whatever epic poems and things, Dante, Milton, etc., they're obviously in that world of drawing on the Bible. And then even in the Muslim world, where they draw still on the Abrahamic tradition, and the Quran is like built into the context of people knowing the stories of the Bible, right? Another slightly different example is there's a story in India about, it's kind of like a collection of folk tales about animals, I think, called the Panchatantra. I'm probably butchering that name. And as I understand it, again, this is something I'd like to investigate in the future. There are tales from Arabia in the 101 Arabian Nights, which are building on or inspired by tales from the Panchatantra. Then Boccaccio in Italy, he wrote another collection of like tales and short stories called the Decameron. And as I understand it, the Decameron features tales from the 1001 Arabian Nights. In turn, Chaucer, all the way in England, at times in places, was inspired by Boccaccio. So I don't know if it's the same tale, probably not being translated through this whole lineage, but basically you have like a little kernel, perhaps, of inspiration coming all the way from India, basically through the Silk Road, probably over to Arabia, finding its way across the Mediterranean to Italy, and then over Europe into Great Britain, with this kernel or this seed of a certain storytelling idea. The Mahabharata was translated into Persian. I don't know exactly the date, but it kind of has its own name. The Rasmana, Rosmnama. I think that I'm butchering that, but basically, this idea of translating the stories of other countries and bringing it into your own culture and understanding. This has a history. This has a precedent going back a long time. It's not just in the last few hundred years that we've had translations of different literature. I mean, I think even in Mesopotamia, which is where, if you're really, really looking into this stuff, this would be the oldest literature we have. In Babylon and in Akkadian, already they're translating and building on the literature of Sumeria. So that goes right back to the beginning of there being writing in different city-states. There were people across different times, across the same time but in a different place, speaking different languages, who transmitted their stories to each other. So basically, there's a precedent for what we're going to investigate here.